Morning all. The Sinquefield Cup continues to be mega exciting, and someone to really watch out for in this tournament so far is Fabiano Caruana. He was on 4 out of 4 before the start of this encounter against Nakamura yesterday. Let's see what happened. D4 from Nakamura, avoiding E4, and we have a Slav defence, very popular at Super GM level. Knight F3, Knight F6, slightly unusual Knight Bd2 move. Bishop F5, and the knight hits that bishop, and Caruana tries to provoke some weaknesses. Bishop E4. Why would black want to do this? Let's put on a Qb3 as well, just in the background for tactical stuff. The thing is here, it's unwise actually to take this bishop. This is already very good for black after knight takes. There's simultaneous threats of E5, hitting the knight, and bishop B4 check, which is exceptionally painful in that particular scenario. So even something like F3, there's an immediate E5, and black's already winning this, believe it or not. So, you know, this is horrendous. So taking is not a good idea. Don't do this in your own games. Instead, we see F3. This seems like a nice way of accelerating central control, but after bishop G6, for the moment, the modest E3, black has a good grip on the E4 square. And white has this option now for a few moves of knight takes G6. It's a double-edged sword option. It gets the bishop pair for sure, but black then has some H-file pressure. And maybe even G5 is useful later. These pawns can unravel with G5 and G6 later, and then the bishop, maybe even a piece can use the G7 square, for example. So for the moment we have E6. And now G3, and to be honest, I didn't really like this. This isn't just from an intuitive, club player perspective. I personally didn't like it. Usually, it seems not too many games from this position. Knight takes or Queen B3. The engine's preference is not actually the natural bishop D3. Well, because actually you can just take the bishop. Pardon me. Bishop E2 is the engine's preference. Yeah, I think taking and then bishop D3. This position here is already a bit troublesome actually. Black seems to have quite significant pressure. We've seen this in a recent mega computer clash that black even castled queenside in a spectacular game of Stockfish. But here, Queen C7 is already annoying. What is happening here? It seems these dark squares are a pain. If white has to do this now, then C5, and it just looks as though black's going to get a very comfortable knight on C6 here and put great scrutiny on these dark squares. So okay, G3 was played now. G3 instead of that bishop E2, and now we have bishop E7. And potentially now, actually, with bishop E7, bishop H5 might actually be even on the cards to preserve the bishop because of this knight G4 business, attacking the knight. So actually, white didn't mind that, actually. A3. So although bishop H5, it does seem technically possible. I'm not sure it's brilliant. Maybe knight G2, actually, is a good idea, and then knight F4 later. So Caruana is really content to let white take this bishop. So we see knight to Bd7, and white now plays c takes d5. So he's not thrilled yet at taking the bishop, and it's here now in this position after c takes d5 that the bishop is taken. For a moment, if we look at other alternatives, knight takes d5 or ed might actually be quite viable as well here. It doesn't seem as though there's anything too wrong with them. Different pawn structure to play with. I mean, maybe this is interesting for the e-file later. The engines have this as about equal this position as well. So okay, c takes d5 was played, and you'll notice something interesting about this position, and it struck me during the real-time analysis yesterday on the live streams, that the knights, both knights, are actually not optimized for this pawn structure. And I think a lot of players wouldn't consider that actually that one's better off on c6 if it could go there, and this one's actually better off on c3. And the reason is, you know, they're quite passive actually, although they're keeping hold of these two squares. This knight, if it's here, is hitting this square. This knight, if it's here, is hitting this square. And it was mentioned actually, even in engine analysis, these rerouting maneuvers, knight b8 or knight b1 to get to c6 or c3 respectively, they're not actually compatible with the structure. And the grandmasters detect that as well, of course. But let's see what happens first. Knight takes g6, h takes g. So we have that dynamic. White has the bishop here, black has the pressure on the h file. Bishop d3, and now actually an immediate e5. Perhaps, I'm not sure there's going to be a lockdown or anything. I was just wondering for a moment if there's going to be a lockdown. No, there's no. It doesn't seem as though there's a major rush to play e5. I mean, there's other moves which seem plausible here for black. So bishop d6, for example. But okay, e5. It doesn't matter about the d pawn. This will be super active for black. If d takes, knight takes, that's really super tasty for black. This position here, even d4 here is dangerous, or queen b6. That would be very unpleasant. So the pawn can actually be dissolved immediately. That's another problem with the knight on d2 here. It's blocking the queen's influence on that d file. So d4 becomes possible there. Okay, so it's left. That situation is left. White just castles, black castles. Queen b3. As I say, both these knights are not entirely optimized just yet. Now to this move, queen c8 was played. Engine suggestion is very interesting here. a6, this is intriguing. Queen takes here, and the computer move in this position, quite staggering. I wonder if you can guess it if I give you 5 seconds, starting from now, to pause the video. Okay, there's a computer move here. Bishop c5. If it's taken, then knight takes, forks queen and bishop, and this is okay for black. It's not winning or anything. It's just okay for black. It's about equal. And the other point about this, if knight b3, then rook b8, and if it takes here, then we just take that. And again, we've got pressure on d3. We've got this fork. End up winning material here. Where's the queen go? In fact, we end up winning material. So an interesting idea, this a6. If this position occurs in future Grandmaster games, I think people will be aware of the engine moves as well. It's just interesting that this a6 seems to work out here. I thought that was quite curious. So anyway, queen c8 here, and technically after this, white's almost at half a pawn advantage, or not, according to my stockfish. Anyway, white's a little bit better. But as I say, these knights are not compatible totally with the structure. White would like to have more pressure on d5. Black would like to have more pressure on d4, and that's not achieved with these passive knights here. And we've seen this classic move, knight b1. It's well worth remembering this. It makes the knight slightly more aggressive centrally to reroute it here. Also, of course, it gives the d2 square without much hassle to unravel the pieces. So a backward developing move, which I think some players would find very surprising. You know, we seem to we assume a lot of the time we want to keep going forward, not going backwards. But here, the moral of the story is going backwards sometimes pays to go forward a bit better. So e takes d4, leaves a target on d4 now, and this pawn will always be shielded by that pawn as well. And now we see black doing the same thing. It's amusing, I think, to see this in action. Knight b8. So both grandmasters agreeing the knight's not optimal on d2 or d7. So this one wants to go to c6. Knight c3, knight c6, counter-attacking on d4 just in time. If knight takes d5, I think this should be okay. I'm not sure rook d8 is the most accurate move here, although that seems okay. Maybe even better is knight takes d4, just immediately taking the pawn, because we've got this bishop c5. That should be okay for black. So white didn't want that. White, Nakamura played bishop e3, and then black supports his d pawn, rook a d1. So the pieces are getting very comfortable, very optimized around this structure. But for me, it looks as though white has one or two weaknesses which don't seem that pleasant to look at. On the other hand, black has the double pawns, white has the bishop pair. Nakamura in this game was consuming a lot of time actually on the clock. It should be noted. Rook fd8, rook fe1, and now start of an interesting knight maneuver. Now this is supporting d5. The knight is free to move and reroute. So how can the knight be made more optimal here? Funny enough, the story is the same as before. Whilst this knight rerouted to put more pressure on d4, it's this one that wants to join the party, and it can actually do so technically now with this kind of maneuver to get to e6, and in fact this bishop can also join in. And this correlates actually very strongly with this experiment of de Groot, which kind of refuted the idea that grandmasters, think a lot more in calculations than, say, IMs. It was found actually that the stronger the player, it seems visually they were looking more at controlling central squares, and it seems here, Caruana is entirely focused on d4 in effect with his moves so far. So 98. A pure clarity of thought to just put more and more pressure on a key central square, and this may be one of the discerning features of stronger players, their respect for the centre and central control. So we see bishop f2, knight c7, and you might think, hold on a sec, let's just block the pawn. I don't think this is good to take. Let's have a quick look. Just wins the queen, in fact, because the knight's actually covering the a6 escape route here. So black is systematically building up pressure now on d4. There's nothing to criticise about these moves so far from Caruana. It's perfect central control, central influence logic in a way. Queen a2. Now we see an interesting move actually after queen a2. Well, Nakamura has unblocked his b pawn, and that might have an influence on the centre later if this is dislodged away from c6. The interesting move is g5. So why is it played now? For example, what is it actually doing? Have a quick look at this position. I think g5 might have been plausible here as well. It's kind of restraining white from the temptation that f4 might be a temptation in the future. I'm not sure it makes much difference anyway. So we see it here in this position, g5. It also means now that g6 becomes possible as a legal move, followed by king g7, which means then in turn the rook can also have the flexibility to play rook h8. So it is an entirely logical move for trying to get all the other bits which are kind of blocked in by that pawn on g6 freer to move and more versatility. So b4, and now we see g6. Like with central control, the more central control you got, the more flexibility of pieces. This is also in a way a flexibility campaign, because then the rook's then more flexible to switch across to h8. Queen d2, king g7. So again, I would say faultless play from a certain logical perspective of piece flexibility and central control. b5. Is this a big problem? The knight, although it's not staring at d4 after moving, is about to anyway from f5. Bishop e3, knight e6, putting pressure on d4 and holding this pawn a bit more. It was double attacked with that battery. Bishop h3, pinning this knight. So bishop takes e6, now threatened with bishop takes g5 to follow. Knight f5 here. Okay, so this blocks that pin. It unpins, it threatens to win the dark square bishop. So safeguarding g5 again, putting more pressure again on d4. Look at all this. Beautiful play from black in terms of d4 play. Bishop takes f5. G takes f5. how the pawns now, actually they seem, getting this pawn towards the centre, I mean white has relinquished the bishop pair, and I'll expect, intuitively, the engine didn't like that. It's about 0 now, about dead equal here. Why did white have to give up the bishop pair? Let's look at this. It's virtually forced actually. If bishop f2, we see the impact of central pressure, I think. Almost. There's pins here. This is not possible. Is it? Well, it does actually it seems possible. But for weird reasons, that maybe white can play rook e3. Not taking here. This isn't good. Knight takes d4. That's a pretty vicious tactic actually. But actually, in this position, this is actually quite a cunning move. Let's see. I mean, what does white do? Bishop takes e6. There's knight takes f3 check. Yeah. The engine suggests something like queen d3 here. So what is this? It's very dangerous. Yes, that shows that actually this is dangerous. Bishop f2 to preserve the bishop pair, which I think a lot of people would sanely choose, does seem to tactically backfire. Bishop f2, knight f takes d4. What's the refutation? If bishop takes e6, knight takes f3. Okay, so maybe that persuaded bishop takes f5. It's given us the engine choice as well. But yeah, it seems as though black, through some neat central control manoeuvring and the plan of g5, which also extends the scope of pieces and flexibility, seems to have reached a dead equal position here, very nearly at move 30. We see now f4, and now we see not taking but g4. I think taking might be a bit troublesome for the f pawn for frontal attack concern. Let's have a quick look. G takes no, actually bishop takes, we've always got bishop takes d4 check. So G takes. For some reason this might have some sort of issue. Maybe queen d3 later. This might be okay for white. Maybe later after the check. This kind of thing to hit f5. So g4 was chosen here. Queen d3. And tactically this is defended now. Not with moving the knight. That would be a passive move, which kind of reduces the central influence on the knight on d4. No, a slightly better move, rook ac8, and it's this level of precision which is really impressive actually about Caruana throughout this tournament. So he's attacking that knight to rook c1, and now again refusing to simply play knight f8. How many players would just play knight f8 here? If knight f8, that would help white, and knight going backwards like this. And in fact, although there's not too much white can do here in terms of pawn breaks, in fact it's still not that pleasant for white. Knight b1, there's still it's okay for black. Maybe rook c4, rook takes. But in the game we see an immediate rook c4 is tactically defending the pawn. If queen takes f5 here, then there's a crushing blow actually in knight takes d4, double attacking the queen. And if queen takes d7, then actually knight f3 check is strong, or just taking here is strong. It's a getting that centre pawn for that double pawn is a fantastic trade for black. And this pawn is marking out the light squares. Black is actually, believe it or not, +3 here or more in terms of engine evaluation. That's how bad it is. In fact, knight b3 is about to win material as well. So I'm not even sure there's anything to do about losing material here, because there's a knight f3 check possibility immediately to parry as well as knight b3. So not pleasant. And if bishop takes, then taking check, winning the knight on c3. Disaster, in fact. It will be. We can call that a poisoned pawn. So knight e2, very very defensive. And another very accurate move from Caruana. This is unbelievable chess, really. Knight c7 now. What does white want to do here? b5 is attacked. We can't just simply play a4. I think that can just be taken, no problem. So what does white do here about b5? Does he want to take on c4? If we take on c4, this wasn't played. Taking, and then knight takes b5, and look at this. Every single piece attacking d4 here. This is what central pressure is all about. Model play from black, and white is just simply worse here. He's actually losing, it seems to be losing material by force. If rook d1, knight takes a3, and then the knight is pretty safe here tactically, actually, with a move like queen b5. Pretty nasty stuff. So looking at e2, that's pretty nasty, and there's two passed pawns here running. So an unpleasant position indeed after knight c7. Knight c3 is played. It seems, you know, white has weaknesses around here which are a cause of concern at this level. Now black just built up here with rook c8. Rook c8. So is there any amazing tactic here? Not really. Any knight takes d5, there's rook takes c1, and there's no check or anything. The king's on g7. It's important the king's on g7. So that's perfectly okay for black. So here, building up, and I'm not entirely sure knight takes b5 is threatened actually, just yet. White plays h3 actually. Now that looks to be an unusual move. Let's just try another move. I think a4. Black could intensify pressure here with knight e8, and then maybe later consider bishop e7, a6 to hit this pawn chain. So I don't know about this move. Maybe it's been played in time pressure or something. It seems a little bit odd that move h3 was played. The evaluation plummets after this to nearly +2 for black. So actually let's take some time to see what was Naka afraid of here. Okay, I mean let's say white, is there anything tactically stopping knight takes b5 on king g2? I think knight takes b5 is fine here for black just to win that pawn. So a4, let's try with a4. It weakens some dark squares. Let's go with knight e8 and see what is the pitfall for black, for white rather. Bishop d8 from an engine perspective. Bishop d8 for bishop a5. Okay, let's follow this through to see what can happen. Rook e2. It seems here knight d6, black's advantage is becoming quite crushing actually. If here, queen e6, and then now what is threatened? Bishop a5. Say knight e2. We can actually take here and win the bishop on e3, so that's no good. So white seems to be becoming a sitting target here for bishop a5. That's interesting. If knight d1 here, then actually even rook takes a4 is possible. So that just shows that some more maneuvers and white would start to fall apart if he didn't seem to do anything. He plays h3 here. It's a bit of a mystery otherwise. I mean, so a4, yes, I guess you can say a4 invites some pain on the dark squares eventually. But yeah, nifty maneuvers potentially in the position, we can say. So h3, strangely losing a pawn, king h2, and now Caruana takes on b5 here. So for the moment, 2 pawns up technically, with f5. Okay, looking a bit loose, but there's pressure on c1 here. So if queen takes f5 here, I think this loses to queen b2 check. Okay, so that loses to queen b2 check. So Naka takes the pawn on h3 now. After queen takes b5, he plays king takes h3. Now this is perhaps threatened, now it's defended. So in this resulting scenario, what has happened? Black is a pawn up. It's not opposite coloured bishops. Black seems to dominate the c file. The c4 square has a 2-to-1 here. Has a lockdown on g4. The problem is for black, these double pawns, in theory, not that great for creating a passed pawn later. King g2, b5 though, but just play on the queen side. Rook b1, a6, taking time. Moves like rook c3 now, looking at a3 are dangerous. Rook bc1, inviting simplification here. Let's have a look at the simplification. Would this have been any good? Black didn't play like this. This is nice for black as well, just piling up the pressure. I mean, this seems very, very comfortable for black. Taking with the other rook here, rook c4 again, it just seems very, very comfortable for black. Okay, so Naka plays, sorry, in this position, after rook bc1, Caruana plays queen e6, and it seems to carry the threat of queen e4 check, which would undouble these pawns potentially, so that would be even better for black. And now here is an interesting decision in a bad position. Naka offers two rooks for the queen in effect, with bishop f2 parrying queen e4 as the threat, but two rooks for the queen. This is not good. This is approaching +3 already for black. It seems Caruana has now a one position which he needs to carry on to take to the win. He plays rook takes c1, and rook takes e6 even undoubles his pawns. So two rooks for that queen. A very good trade. And immediately Naka's next move at move 44 is not looked on very well by engines in this position after g4. This could have been now nearly +6. Can you see black to play with a crushing move, exploiting the weakness of this last move? In fact, if that's the clue, and I give you 5 seconds to pause the video, what could you play here with black? Okay, bishop h4, it's really crushing. It's threatening to win that bishop, and if takes here, we just play this, and the queen is won, basically leaving white the exchange down. Where does the queen go? We just win the queen, and we've got still the 2-to-1 pawn majority, so that's hopeless for white. So that would have been a knockout blow straight away. Bishop h4, f takes g4 was played, still good. Queen e2. This is indirectly defended with king f7, implying rook g8 if the queen dare takes for a skewer against the queen, against the king. Queen d3, and now Caruana goes all in with the rook pinning the bishop now, not minding the check. A little bit of a nuisance, but black is looking forward to exploiting that pin. f5, the bishop now drops off the board. After bishop takes d4, the bishop's going. White gets a few checks in. Check. Queen takes, another bishop's taken. Black has a big material advantage. It's basically lost here at move 51. Check. 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 King c7. I think that is one of the better moves. The engine is actually suggesting king c7 here. White might be threatening queen d6, which would be annoying. Check. The king goes to b6, where it can be safeguarded via the c7 square now on queen d8. So queen d8, rook c7, not minding about the d5 pawn. A small price to pay a small price to pay for king safety. Bishop c5, and there's not many checks now. Queen d8, king b7 unpinning. The king can always go to a7 now on queen d5, but Naka played f6. Is this a final trap or not? Not really. There's nothing really. It seems nothing really seems difficult here for black. Bishop takes a3 is played. There is the check. Now the king just goes to b6. Queen d8, bishop c5, check, rook b7, check, and the king goes to a very cozy spot now on a7, away from all the checks. It just remains for this pawn ideally to be removed. Queen d5, bishop b6, king g5, rook c7, now threatening rook c5, winning the queen, king g6, and now black plays b4. Yep, these pawns are starting to move. Queen e6, bishop d4 is going to get rid of this pawn, and with that Nakamura resigned. Caruana's play in this game is very crisp, very precise, to do with a lot of central control and flexibility in the wider sense. If we look at his moves, all about the d4 square, doesn't mind about losing the bishop pair. I think someone mentioned on Chessgames.com, Annan's preference sometimes is to preserve the bishop. I don't think black got much of an opportunity even to preserve the bishop though in this game. There was no opportunity for h6 and for the bishop to go to h7. So we have that interesting dynamic in this game of white having the bishop pair. But it seems through the knight maneuvers, very, very good knight maneuvers, the light square bishop seemed compelled later on to give itself up, as we saw. With this knight maneuver coming to e6 and this other one coming to f5, it seems great scrutiny on that d4 square. So De Groot would be proud of this game in terms of central control being a major factor, not calculation, positional, central control and influence. So g6 starts another flexibility campaign. So the rook can now go to h8. This b5, to be honest, in retrospect, objectively, at this point it was 0.20 for white, which represents a small advantage. Maybe b5 didn't really help white's cause. It created some potential dark square weaknesses. And we see, you know, later in variations how these dark square weaknesses can be fatal even on this diagonal if this bishop's coming to this diagonal. Also the c4 square. So it seems, I don't know, b5 in retrospect seems on the loose side, but if white's playing for a win, what does white do here? Bishop g2, that's mentioned. It's a different game, I guess. Maybe this would have been better than the game. Then white can play f4. g4. This looks as though white still has the bishop pair at least, and without too many concerns about dropping pawns on the queen side. But even here, the engine's, you know, suggesting b5. I don't know, subtle changes in the position on b5 might be useful, but it's a double-edged sword, of course, like a lot of other things in chess. But here, okay, b5 played here. It seems black's maneuvers now cause white to lose the light square bishop, and simply puts now, this really looks terrible, this c4 square for white, if black can just install a rook there and start building the pressure behind the rook. Positionally, it looks as though white's being murdered positionally, and tactically things are being held together, with the knight refusing to budge to simply defend the pawn. Very, very accurate play here from black. That central influence really counts here for not having to worry too much about the position, or well, the f5 pawn in particular. But now knight c7 and white's queen side is put under great scrutiny. So here, an opportunity to play a simple looking move like a4 is not possible. Actually, the knight's move, we can just take that. So already, you know, black's really putting pressure on white's queen side pawns. Taking here, it just doesn't look good. It looks as though the position is falling apart even from here at move 34. Black's building up pressure. This h3 is a sign of desperation. But yeah, with maneuvers like this on the cards, it just looks very painful with the doubled rooks here on c3. If that pressure can be intensified even further. That's horrible then. So okay, h3, and Caruana just remains in the driving seat here, getting the 2 rooks for the queen. Pretty soon really spells the end of the game here, after rook takes c1, and it could have been extremely shortened, the game now, with bishop h4, the tactical bishop h4, but there was a few more moves. Yes, Caruana has really impressed in this tournament. This must be his most impressive tournament in his career, and one of the most impressive tournaments I've ever seen in modern Super Grandmaster chess. He's now on 5 out of 5, and this is just it seems a crystal clear win without too much controversy. Very convincing, as they say. That word convincing comes to mind when someone wins without too much controversy. What do you guys think? Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.